Hello everyone, I welcome you to Legacy IAS where we're going to talk about an important discussion of the comparison between the constitutional systems of India and Canada. Now, India, we all know that while making the constitution has a lot of influences from other countries of the world. We looked at other countries and some of the tried and tested principles and tried to mold it as to how they can suit to our domestic scenario. In this respect, Canada plays a very important role. Canada has an important position in helping India have a strong structure of government. And in this particular video, we're going to talk about what are the influences that India has taken from Canada, but also in the final constitutional systems. What are the similarities and the differences between the two countries and their forms of government and constitutional systems? So, if we look at the features which we've borrowed from Canada, we of course very importantly have a federation which is not molded around the American Constitution but along the Canadian Constitution, because our history of having a federation was very different from the US. We basically had to form a federation, give them some powers, but even though have a strong center to manage and keep them in the construct that we created as India. Because had that not been there, maybe we would not have the India that we see today. So the reorganization of states was a very important task, and in this regard, our influence from Canada played a very important role. We also had the residuary powers in the center, which also was slightly influenced from Australia but also from Canada, the way in which our residuary powers are actually there with the center. Now, if we look at the way in which the state governors are appointed, all right, the appointment of the governors by the center is something that we have basically taken from Canada. It also is in a way where the center is trying to keep a lot of control with itself, where it has a say in the affairs of in the executive and the legislative affairs of the states, and it gets to know about the administration of the states, and that is through the appointment of this governor by the center. We also have the system of advisory jurisdiction in the Supreme Court, whereby the president, let's say the executive head of the state, can consult the Supreme Court on certain matters, all right, as important to constitutional positions coming together and discussing and having an opinion on something. So this kind of a concept, this kind of a jurisdiction is also something that was influenced and taken from the Canadian Constitution. We also have to look at the areas in which these two countries and their constitutional systems are very similar. Firstly, if we look at the representative democracy, the form in which we have public getting actually represented in the government, and the government is of the people, for the people, and by the people. So this concept of representative democracy is something that is very, very similar between the two countries. The way in which individual rights are protected does not require any introduction, how fundamental rights are so very important and sacrosanct in the Indian Constitution. Even in Canada, we have a lot of emphasis being given to that particular individual and their rights. All right, the entire country is based on these democratic principles and values, where the entire onus of decision making actually at the end lies on the public, is also a very similar undermining thread of commonality between the two countries, which kind of brings them together on a lot of foundational values and principles. All right, the parliamentary form of government that is there in India is also similarly there in Canada. The way in which we have the executive being a part of the legislature, but more so there is a real head and a de jure head or a nominal head. That is also a distinct feature of the parliamentary form of government, very similar between India and Canada. The executive dominance of the prime minister remains at the federal level. Like I was telling you, in a parliamentary form of government, there is a real head. So the prime minister is actually the head of the government and the main executive head. All right, in India, we see how the prime minister aids and advises the president. The same way, there's an executive dominance, a stronghold of the prime minister in Canada as well. There is a premier at the provincial level. We have that in the form of governors. But there's this kind of similarity that we see between the two strands at the central as well as the state level. If we look at the way in which the federal system is formed, there is absolutely no discussion on the way in which our center and the position of center is there in both the countries. Very, very similarly, a very strong center who has the final decision making on some very important key issues concerning the country, but also the way in which the administration of the state has to be done, also the residuary powers which lie with the center. These are also things which we have been influenced by from Canada, but ultimately the way in which we have implemented it and we've been functioning with it also makes it a point of similarity. The members in both the countries are actually elected by this system of first past the post. Now, India, of course, adopted this system because we had very poor levels of literacy. All right, we did not have a very politically educated electorate voter base in India when we started the system, and it's very simple, easy enough for us to understand and even count. So that is also something that we've continued, and this is also a system which is being practiced heavily in Canada as well. We have the seats in the House of Commons or the lower house being distributed on the basis of population of each province. In India, this particular task is being done by the Delimitation Commission based on the census report, whereby the entire country is being divided into constituencies based on population. So the census report, which gives us the population data, is being used by the Delimitation Commission to kind of map the constituencies for the entire country or the state, whatever election is in question. So that is again a common area of a similarity. We also have a very responsible government in both India as well as Canada, which is particularly responsible to the lower house. If we look at India, we have the government who should have or who should enjoy majority in the lower house of the parliament. That kind of a similar accountability is a common strand between India as well as Canada. We have the central government being appointing the governor for both this for the states as well as the provinces. So we have basically the role of the center in the administration of the states. The executive also is elected by the first past the post system. We have that kind of similar system for all the direct elections that take place in India. If you look at the Supreme Court of Canada, it is the highest court of authority and the final authority on all matters of civil, criminal, and constitutional questions. So, similarly, we have our Supreme Court at the apex taking a final word on all such matters concerning the legal department. All right. So, in that sense, the Supreme Court of Canada also enjoys a similar position. Residuary powers, the way in which it is present in India, is very similar to Canada. But there are a lot of differences also which lie between the two constitutions. Firstly, we have in India only a written constitution, but Canada has parts of both written as well as unwritten law. All right, in UK we have that in the form of, let's say, conventions or parliamentary sovereignty. In Canada it is in the form of written and unwritten. Now, in the Canadian Constitution, if you look at the preamble, it actually resembles a lot or recognizes the importance that the British have given or the British has in that particular country, and Quebec has been given actually a distinct society status. So in that sense, that connect, we in India actually managed to kind of sever all that dependence from the British government, and we managed to become sovereign nations, not even dominion. But here we have a major influence of the British society, the British government on the Canadian society, whereby to the extent that the British Queen is actually the formal head of the state. This is a major, major difference between the two countries, the way in which we see our executive head of the state. There is also the executive government and authority in Canada vested in the Canadian monarchy. All right. So besides the Queen, we also have the Canadian monarchy. The way in which we have the executive head of the state in India being elected, that is actually a monarchical form of government in Canada. Now, if you look at the constitution, basically it provides for the Governor General of Canada, who is basically appointed by the monarch. okay, on the advice of the prime minister. So here we have a very different form of government in India, because our president, who's the head of the state, it's actually indirectly elected. So this kind of a system in the structure, in the appointment, and in the allegiance finally, which is there of the executive head, is a very big stark difference between India and Canadian constitution. Now, when we look at the act which basically has established the constitution, it basically established a federal parliament which is consisting of not just the monarchy but also the legislative chambers, which is basically the upper house and the senate. Now, we have in this case, our variation is a president and also a vice president. All right, so in that sense, we have that kind of a difference in the way in which the legislature is being organized in Canada. We also have differences in the way in which citizenship is there in the country, because in Canada there is a provision of dual citizenship. In India, we try to promote fraternity and brotherhood, and that's why we have only a single citizenship, that someone is only a citizen of India and not of any of the federating units. So that is a point of difference between the two countries. Also, the way in which we have a single system, an integrated independent system of judiciary that is there in India, that is very different, because there are multiple legal systems which are present in Canada. So this kind of multiple legal systems are also independent but yet work in coordination with each other. So this multiple systems is something that is completely absent as far as the Indian system is concerned. So in this regard, even though there has been a major influence that Canada has had in the way in which we've organized the federation in the country, there are several differences in terms of the executive and legislative and even judicial matters and questions of citizenship between the two countries. So this also kind of helps us understand to what extent and in what areas can we leverage our friendship and what can be points of differences between the two countries. So I hope you've enjoyed the discussion with us. Thank you so much.